He was a man returning to a place that no longer existed, a ghost haunting a memory. He drove a beat-up sedan down a road that was more suggestion than pavement, 2 tire tracks swallowed by weeds and wildflowers. And at the end of it, he found a farmhouse and 200 acres of land that had been waiting for him for 25 years. What he discovered there, buried under a quarter-century of dust and silence, would leave him speechless and change not only his future, but the very meaning of his past. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own life, or wondered if there was more to your story than you've been told, then you'll want to stick around. Hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just about a farm. It's about what we inherit, what we fight for, and how we find our way back home. The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound that felt both alien and deeply familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby. For 25 years, this place had been a faded photograph in my mind, a collection of sensory fragments, the smell of hay and rain, the rough texture of my grandfather's calloused hand, the taste of my grandmother's blackberry pie. I was 5 years old when I left. I didn't leave by choice. One day they were there, my entire world contained within the sturdy walls of that farmhouse and the endless green of the fields, and the next they were gone. A car accident on a slippery road, the official report said. A tragedy. I became a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet, passed through a series of houses that were never homes. Now, at 30, I was back. Not for a reunion, but for a funeral of sorts. The farm, the last piece of my history, was dying too. An inheritance, the lawyer had called it. It felt more like a burden. A thick manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, filled with legal documents I barely understood. Delinquent taxes, foreclosure notices, a final offer from a development company. It was a ticking clock. I killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, layered with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the oak trees that lined the drive, the distant caw of a crow. The air smelled of damp earth and wild mint. I stepped out of the car and my boots sank slightly into the soft ground. The house stood before me, paint peeling from its clapboard siding like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged on one side, a weary sigh frozen in wood. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out at a world that had moved on without them. It looked smaller than I remembered, but everything from childhood does. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, a strange mix of grief and terror, and a longing so sharp it was a physical ache. This was the place where my life began, and the place where it had, in a way, ended. I walked up the 3 creaking steps to the porch, my hand hesitating over the tarnished brass doorknob. The key the lawyer had sent me felt cold and heavy in my palm. It was the key to a tomb. I had 2 weeks to sign the papers, to sell this land to Horizon Corp., the developers who had been sending letters for years. They offered to pay off all the back taxes and debts and leave me with a small but significant sum of money. Enough to start over, for real this time. A clean break. It was the sensible thing to do, the only thing to do. So why did it feel like a betrayal? I slid the key into the lock. It resisted, stiff from disuse. With a final grim turn, the lock gave way with a loud, echoing clunk. The sound seemed to travel through the entire house, waking ghosts. I pushed the door open, and the smell of my past rushed out to greet me. Dust, dried lavender, old paper, and something else, something faint and warm and achingly familiar. Home. The air inside was thick and still, a time capsule of my grandparents' last day. A fine layer of gray dust coated every surface, a soft shroud over a life interrupted. Sunlight struggled through the grimy window panes, cutting long, hazy shafts through the gloom, illuminating dancing motes of dust. In the entryway, a pair of my grandfather's muddy work boots stood by the door, as if he'd just taken them off after a long day in the fields. A faded floral apron, my grandmother's, was draped over the back of a rocking chair. It was all exactly as I'd been told it would be. After the accident, the state had simply locked the door. Everything was preserved, a perfect, heartbreaking diorama of a life I barely remembered. I walked through the downstairs rooms like a trespasser. The living room, with its stone fireplace and sagging floral sofa. The dining room, the long oak table set for 3, a ghostly echo of a meal that was never eaten. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was still turned to October 1998. A circle was drawn around the 27th, my 6th birthday. They had died 2 days before. The sight of it was a punch to the gut. All these years I had thought of their deaths as an abstract event, a line drawn in the sand of my life. But this calendar, this simple circle of red ink, made it real. They had been planning for me. They had been waiting for me, and I never came. I sank into a dusty armchair, the manila envelope from the lawyer feeling like a lead weight in my lap. I pulled out the main document, the offer from Horizon Corp. It was professionally printed on heavy cardstock, the logo a stylized rising sun. The numbers were clear, the terms simple. They wanted the land, all 200 acres. In exchange, they would wipe the slate clean. The property taxes had piled up for 25 years, an insurmountable mountain of debt. The house was falling apart. The barn was probably structurally unsound. The fields were overgrown. There was nothing here for me but ghosts and debt. Selling was the logical choice, the adult choice. It was the choice anyone would make. I could walk away with enough money to get a real apartment, maybe go back to school, build a life that wasn't defined by the temporary nature of the foster system, a fresh start. The phrase echoed in my head, something caseworkers had said to me every time I was moved to a new family. This is a fresh start, Leo. But it never was. It was just a new chapter in the same book, a book whose first chapter had been ripped out. Maybe this was my chance to finally write a new book altogether. I picked up a silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece. Wiping away the dust with my thumb, I saw their faces. My grandfather, a tall man with kind eyes crinkled at the corners, his arm slung around my grandmother's shoulders. She was smiling, a warm, genuine smile that I felt more than I remembered. And standing between them was a little boy with a gap-toothed grin and a mop of unruly blonde hair. Me. We looked happy. We looked like a family, a real family. A wave of anger, hot and unexpected, washed over me. Anger at them for leaving. Anger at the slick road, the bad luck, the universe. Anger at myself for not being able to remember more, for letting the memories fade into indistinct blurs. I put the photo back down, my hand shaking slightly. I had to stop this. This was just a building. The land was just dirt. The memories were just ghosts. They couldn't help me pay my rent or build a future. The money from Horizon Corp could. I stood up, resolved. I would spend one night here for old time's sake. I would sleep in my old room, say a proper goodbye to the ghosts. And in the morning, I would call the lawyer and tell him to accept the offer. It was time to let go. It was time for a fresh start. For real, this time. But as I stood there in the fading light of the afternoon, a floorboard upstairs creaked. It was probably just the old house settling, but in the heavy silence it sounded like a footstep. It sounded like the house wasn't ready to be let go of just yet. I spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the house, my decision to sell warring with a rising tide of curiosity. Every object seemed to whisper a story I couldn't quite hear. I ran my fingers over the worn spines of the books in my grandfather's study, histories, farming almanacs, poetry. On his desk, a heavy, old-fashioned fountain pen lay next to a stack of blank paper, as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. It was in that study, a room that smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, that I found the first breadcrumb. Tucked away on the bottom shelf of a bookcase, behind a row of National Geographics, was a small dark wooden box with a simple brass latch. It wasn't locked. My heart beat a little faster as I lifted it out and placed it on the dusty desk. What could be inside? Old coins, forgotten trinkets? I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded red velvet, was a single, thick envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's elegant looping cursive. Leo. Just my name. No date, no other words. My breath caught in my throat. It was a letter from the dead. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The paper was thick, creamy, and felt impossibly ancient. The envelope wasn't sealed. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out 2 folded pages. The ink was a faded blue, the handwriting a testament to a time when people took care with their words. I unfolded the pages and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Your grandfather and I are gone, and you have come back to this house a man. I can only imagine the person you've become. I hope you are strong. I hope you are kind. I hope, against all odds, that you have been happy." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I wiped them away impatiently, forcing myself to continue. "There is so much I want to tell you, so much I wish we'd had the time to say. But time is a luxury we weren't afforded. So I must be direct. Leo, our death was not an accident." I read the line again, and then a third time. The air in the room grew cold, the silence more profound. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old house crept down my spine. Not an accident. The words hung in the air, rewriting 25 years of my history in a single, brutal stroke. "We were not careless, my love," the letter continued. "Your grandfather was the best driver I ever knew. But there are people who wanted this land, people who saw it not as a home, but as a resource to be exploited. They tried to pressure us, to intimidate us, to buy us out. Your grandfather was a stubborn man. He was born on this land, and he intended to die on this land. He just never imagined it would be so soon." My mind was reeling. Who were they? What did they want? The letter didn't name names. It was as if she was afraid to commit them to paper, even in a letter she never expected to be read. "I don't know what you've been told about this place," she wrote. "I'm sure they've let the taxes pile up, made it seem like an anchor around your neck. I'm sure they've made you an offer that seems too good to refuse. A clean slate, a fresh start. They are very good at making things seem simple. But nothing about this land is simple, Leo. It holds a secret, a gift. Your grandfather called it the heart of the farm. He protected it his whole life, and in the end, it cost him everything. A gift? A secret?" My eyes scanned the page, hungry for answers. What was she talking about? "I have left you a choice, my boy. That's the one thing they can't take from you. The world will tell you to sell, to take the money and run. And I will not blame you if you do. You have suffered enough. You owe us nothing. But if there is a part of you that feels the pull of this place, if the fight of your grandfather still runs in your veins, then you must look for what he left behind. He knew they might come for us. He prepared. He left you the tools you would need. Go to the barn. In the old milking parlor, the third stall from the door, look beneath the floor. What you find there will explain everything. Whatever you choose, Leo, know this. We loved you more than words can say. You were our sunrise and our sunset. Be brave, be good, and live. Your loving grandmother, Eleanor. I folded the letter, my hands numb. The room felt like it was tilting on its axis. The story of my life, the simple, tragic story of an orphan, had just been ripped apart. It wasn't a story of bad luck, it was a story of a fight, a murder. My grandparents hadn't abandoned me. They had been taken from me. The offer from Horizon Corp, sitting on the dining room table, suddenly seemed sinister. Were they the ones? The people who wanted the land. The timing was too perfect. I stood up, the letter clutched in my hand. My earlier resolution to sell had evaporated, replaced by a burning, furious need for the truth. One night. I had planned to spend one night here to say goodbye. But now, goodbye was the furthest thing from my mind. I had to go to the barn. I had to find what my grandfather had left for me. My grandmother's words echoed in my head. Be brave. For the first time in my life, I felt like I knew what that meant. It wasn't about enduring the next foster home or surviving another lonely night. It was about facing the truth, no matter how terrifying. I walked out of the study and through the silent house. The ghosts were no longer just memories. They were allies, pointing the way. I grabbed an old flashlight from a hook in the kitchen, its beam weak but steady, and stepped out into the twilight. The barn loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple sky. It held the answers, and I was going to find them. The path to the barn was overgrown, the grass tall and wet with evening dew. My jeans were soaked in minutes, but I barely noticed. My entire being was focused on that dark, hulking structure ahead. The air was cool, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the loamy smell of the earth. The barn was even more dilapidated than the house. Several planks were missing from its sides, creating dark, gaping wounds. The huge sliding door was off its runners, leaning precariously inward. It took all my strength to shove it open, just enough to slip through the gap. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of 100 harvests. The smell of old hay, dust, and dry rot was overwhelming. High above, the cavernous ceiling was lost in shadow, crisscrossed with cobwebs as thick as cotton. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, striping the dusty floor with silver. It was a cathedral of decay. I clicked on my flashlight, its weak yellow beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. Pigeons rustled in the rafters, their cooing a mournful, ghostly sound. I made my way toward the back, where the milking parlor used to be. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, and the metal stanchions were rusted solid. It was a place of work, of sweat, of life. Now it was just a shell. The third stall from the door, my grandmother had written. I counted them off, my light trembling in my hand. 1, 2, 3. The third stall was like the others, empty except for a thick layer of dust and straw. I knelt down, my heart pounding against my ribs. Look beneath the floor. The floor was concrete. For a moment, my hope sank. How could there be anything beneath solid concrete? But then my light caught something, a faint outline, almost invisible under the grime. A perfect square, about 2 feet by 2 feet in the center of the stall. It wasn't a separate slab. It looked more like the concrete had been scored after it was poured, and in one corner, a small, rusted iron ring was set flush with the surface. My breath hitched. This was it. I dug my fingers into the ring and pulled. Nothing. It was sealed tight with 25 years of grime and corrosion. I stood up and looked around frantically. I needed a tool, something to pry it open. I spotted an old toolbox in the corner, its contents a jumble of rusted metal. I found a heavy-duty crowbar, its weight reassuring in my hands. I wedged the tip into the faint crack around the square and put all my weight into it. The metal groaned in protest. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden jarring crack, the seal broke. A puff of dry, musty air escaped from below. I worked the crowbar around the edges, breaking the slab free. Finally, I was able to lift it. It was immensely heavy, but adrenaline gave me strength. I heaved it aside, where it landed with a loud thud that echoed through the entire barn. I shone my light into the hole. It was a small, brick-lined cavity, about 3 feet deep. And at the bottom sat another box. This one was different from the first. It was a military-style ammunition can made of heavy-gauge steel, painted olive drab. It looked solid, airtight, and meant to withstand anything. My grandfather had planned well. I reached down and lifted it out. It was heavy, far heavier than a box of letters should be. I carried it out of the stall and set it down in a clear patch of floor. The latches were stiff but opened with a satisfying metallic snap. I took a deep breath, feeling like I was about to open Pandora's box, and lifted the lid. The contents were packed tightly. On top was another stack of envelopes, tied together with twine. But these were written in a different hand, my grandfather's. It was a strong, no-nonsense script, the letters sharp and angular. Beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of documents. Property deeds going back 100 years, geological survey maps covered in notations, and copies of legal correspondence between my grandfather and a company called Stone Creek Development, a name I didn't recognize. And at the very bottom, I found the source of the weight: 2 small, heavy canvas pouches. I untied one and poured the contents into my palm. My eyes widened. Gold coins. Dozens of them, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. They were old, bearing dates from the early 20th century. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was far from nothing. It was a war chest. My grandfather hadn't just left me a story. He'd left me ammunition. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of the barn, the contents of the box spread around me, and I began to read my grandfather's letters. They were not addressed to me, but to a future that he hoped would never come to pass. They were a chronicle of a secret war. "If you are reading this," the first one began, "it means Eleanor and I have failed, and it means the wolves are at the door again. Do not trust them. Do not believe their promises. Their tongues are slick with honey, but their hearts are full of gravel." He wrote about Stone Creek Development, how they had first approached him years before I was even born. They wanted the land, and they were willing to pay handsomely. He refused. The farm wasn't for sale. It was his legacy, his home, but they were persistent. The letters became more frequent, the offers higher. When he continued to refuse, their methods changed. He wrote about intimidation, fences cut in the night, a prize bull mysteriously sickening and dying, anonymous, threatening phone calls. They were trying to bleed him dry, to make running the farm so difficult, so costly, that he would have no choice but to sell. He fought back. He hired a lawyer, filed complaints with the sheriff, but they were a faceless corporation with deep pockets. It was his word against theirs, and no one wanted to believe that a respectable development company would resort to such tactics. The reason for their obsession was laid bare in the geological surveys. My grandfather had commissioned them himself in secret. The maps were detailed, showing the topography of the land, the rock strata, the water table. And in the center of our 200 acres, my grandfather had drawn a large circle in red ink. Inside the circle, he'd written one word: aquifer. According to the surveyor's notes, it wasn't just any aquifer. It was a massive, pristine, self-recharging underground reservoir of pure water, one of the largest in the entire state. In a region that was increasingly prone to drought, a resource like that wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. It was a gold mine of clear, fresh water. And my grandparents were sitting right on top of it. Stone Creek Development didn't want the land for houses. They wanted it for the water. They wanted to sink wells, build a bottling plant, and sell our water back to the world. My grandfather saw it as a sacred trust. The water nourished his land, fed the creek that ran through the valley, and supported the entire local ecosystem. To him, selling it would be like selling his own blood. So he fought. And he prepared. He started converting his savings into untraceable gold coins, a stash for a rainy day he prayed would never arrive. Then, about a year before they died, Stone Creek Development suddenly vanished. They sold their holdings and disappeared. My grandfather wrote of his relief, his hope that the fight was finally over. But then, a few months later, a new company emerged, Horizon Corp. They bought up all of Stone Creek's old assets. They were bigger, slicker, with a friendly corporate image and a name that spoke of bright futures. And they started sending letters again. The final letter in the stack was dated October 24th, 1998. The day before the accident. His handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. "They're getting desperate," he wrote. "A man came to the farm today. Not a lawyer, not a salesman. He was different. He didn't make an offer. He made a threat. He said we were standing in the way of progress. He said accidents happen. Eleanor's scared. For the first time, I'm scared too. Not for me, but for her, and for little Leo. I'm putting this box away tonight. If anything happens to us, the truth is here. The fight is here. Leo, if this is in your hands, the choice is yours. The gold is enough to pay the back taxes and hire a good lawyer, but it will be a long, hard road. Or you can take their money. Live your life free from this burden. No one would ever blame you. This is my fight, not yours. But this land, this water, it's a part of you too. Whatever you do, son, do it with a full heart." I sat there in the darkness, the flashlight beam dying, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My whole body was shaking, a storm of grief and rage, and a terrifying, clarifying purpose. The clean slate Horizon Corp was offering me wasn't a fresh start. It was blood money. They had harassed my grandparents. They had threatened them, they had killed them, and for 25 years, they had gotten away with it. They had played the long game, waiting for the debt to grow, waiting for the sole heir to appear, a lost and lonely kid who wouldn't know any better, who would be so grateful for a lifeline that he wouldn't think to ask where the money was coming from. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated me. The knot in my chest, the one that had been there for as long as I could remember, the knot of the abandoned child, finally loosened. I wasn't abandoned. I was the last soldier in a war I never knew was being fought. My inheritance wasn't 200 acres of dying farmland. It was this box. It was this story. It was this choice. And in the cold, silent darkness of that barn, surrounded by the ghosts of my family, the choice was not hard at all. It was the only choice there was. Now, I want to pause the story for a moment and just talk to you, directly. If you've made it this far, thank you. This part of the story, sitting on that cold floor with the truth in my hands, was a turning point. And maybe you've had a moment like that in your own life. A moment where the story you were told about your past, about your family, or about yourself was suddenly turned on its head. A moment where you discovered that what you thought was a weakness was actually a source of strength. Or what you believed was an ending was actually the beginning of a fight. It's a terrifying and incredibly powerful feeling, isn't it? It feels like the ground has fallen out from under you, but it also feels like for the first time, you can finally plant your feet on solid rock. If you've ever had a moment that changed everything you thought you knew, I'd be honored if you shared a little about it in the comments below. You don't have to share details, just the feeling. Because I want you to know, and I want everyone in this community to know, that you are not alone in that experience. We're all piecing together our own truths. Okay, let's get back to the barn. The sun was about to rise, and I had a phone call to make. The first slivers of dawn were painting the eastern sky gray as I walked back to the house. The world felt different, sharper. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the wind in the trees. It all sounded like a secret language I was only now beginning to understand. I carried the ammo can in one hand and my grandfather's last letter in the other. I was no longer a ghost haunting a memory. I was the custodian of a legacy. Back in the dusty kitchen, I made a pot of coffee on the old gas stove, the hiss and pop of the flame a comforting domestic sound in the heavy silence. As the coffee percolated, filling the room with its rich, dark aroma, I laid out the contents of the box on the oak table. The letters, the maps, the deeds, the 2 heavy pouches of gold. It was a strange and powerful inheritance. It was evidence, it was motive, it was means. It was everything I needed to turn their clean slate into a battlefield. My phone had only 1 bar of service, but it was enough. I found the lawyer's card in the manila envelope from Horizon Corp. His name was Arthur Davies. His office was in the small town about 20 miles away. I dialed the number. It was barely 6 in the morning, but I was banking on him being an early riser. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Davies?" "Mr. Davies, this is Leo Vance," I said, my own voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I'm calling about the property on Route 4, my grandparents' farm." "Ah, Mr. Vance. Good morning. I trust you arrived safely. Have you had a chance to look over the offer from Horizon?" His tone was all business, pragmatic and a little weary, the sound of a man who had dealt with a lot of messy estates. "I have," I said, taking a sip of the scalding coffee, "and I'm rejecting it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him sitting up straighter in his chair. "Rejecting it, Mr. Vance, with all due respect, that offer is the only thing standing between that property and a sheriff's auction. The back taxes are substantial. There is no other buyer." "I'm aware of the taxes," I said calmly, "and I intend to pay them, at least a portion of them, enough to stop the foreclosure proceedings." Another pause, this one longer. "May I ask, with what funds you intend to do that?" he asked, a note of cautious skepticism in his voice. I looked at the gold coins glittering on the table. "With a rainy day fund my grandfather left me. Mr. Davies, I found some things here at the farm. Letters, documents. I think you and I need to meet, today, if possible. I believe my grandparents' death 25 years ago was not an accident, and I believe Horizon Corp., or at least their predecessor, was involved." The silence on the line was now absolute. I had laid all my cards on the table. I had no idea how he would react. He could have dismissed me as a grieving, paranoid young man grasping at straws. He could have told me it was ancient history, impossible to prove, and advised me to take the money and run. But he didn't. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The weariness was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He hung up. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The first domino had fallen. The fight had begun. While I waited for him, I walked through the house again. This time it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a fortress. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the dusty furniture, they were no longer signs of decay, but scars of a long battle. This house had stood its ground. It had kept its secrets safe for me. I went upstairs to my old room. The wallpaper was faded, covered in little blue rocket ships. My bed was still there. A small wooden frame with a thin, lumpy mattress. On the nightstand was a single book, Where the Wild Things Are. I picked it up. the cover worn smooth from countless readings. I'd been a wild thing, sent away across the sea of the foster care system. But now I was back, and I was king of this place. A car door slamming outside broke my reverie. I looked out the window and saw a modest sedan parked behind my own. A man in a slightly rumpled suit, probably in his late 50s, was walking toward the house. Arthur Davies. I went downstairs and met him at the door. He was shorter than he sounded on the phone, with thinning gray hair and intelligent, weary eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked me up and down, taking in my dusty clothes and the determined set of my jaw. "Mr. Vance," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm. "You've had quite a night." "You have no idea," I replied, leading him into the kitchen. I gestured to the table, to the evidence laid out like a general's battle map. "This is what I found." He stood over the table for a long time, silent. He picked up my grandfather's letters, reading them one by one. He examined the geological surveys, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. He hefted one of the pouches of gold, a low whistle escaping his lips. He was no longer just a small-town lawyer dealing with a simple probate case. He was looking at the anatomy of a corporate crime, a 25-year-long conspiracy. "Stone Creek Development," he murmured, tapping a finger on one of the old legal letters. "I remember them. They were aggressive, caused a lot of trouble for a few local families trying to buy up land on the cheap. Then they just vanished, sold out to the new guys." "Horizon Corp," I said. "It's the same people, isn't it?" "Different name, same beast," he confirmed, his eyes dark. "They learned to be smarter, to present a friendlier face, but the hunger is the same." He finally looked up at me, his gaze piercing. "You understand what you're doing, son. You're not just rejecting an offer, you're picking a fight with a giant. They have teams of lawyers, endless resources. They will try to crush you." "They crushed my family," I said, my voice low and steady. "They took my entire life from me. What else do I have to lose?" He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, maybe even admiration, in his eyes. "Okay," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Okay, then let's get to work. First things first. We need to get these coins appraised and deposited. We'll use them to pay the most immediate tax liens and put the rest on retainer for my firm. That will stop the auction and show the county we're serious. Second, I'm going to file an injunction against Horizon Corp., a temporary restraining order to prevent any contact or further offers, citing harassment based on this historical evidence." He gestured to the letters. "It might not stick, but it will throw a wrench in their gears. It will let them know that the game has changed. Third, and this is the most important part, you and I are going to go through every single piece of paper your grandfather left. Every receipt, every note, every calendar. We're looking for a name. The man who came to the farm. The one who threatened them. Your grandfather didn't name him in the letter, but he might have written it down somewhere else. A name would give us a thread to pull." He looked around the dusty kitchen, then back at me. A small, grim smile touched his lips. "It's a long shot, Mr. Vance, a very long shot, but I haven't had a fight this good in years." For the first time since I'd arrived, I smiled back. "Call me Leo," I said, "and I think my grandfather would have liked you." The days that followed were a blur of dust and discovery. Arthur, he insisted I call him Arthur, was a man possessed. He set up a makeshift office on the great oak dining table, and together we began the painstaking process of archaeological forensics. We went through every drawer, every closet, every box in the house. We were no longer just looking for clues. We were resurrecting a life. We found my grandmother's journals, filled not with secrets, but with recipes, gardening notes, and tender observations about a little boy who loved to chase butterflies. We found my grandfather's farm ledgers, meticulous records of profits and losses, of good years and bad, and in the margins we found his life. Scrawled notes about the weather, the birth of a calf, a reminder to fix the fence by the creek, and occasionally something darker. A single entry from 1997 read, "Tires slashed on the truck again. No proof, just them." Another, "Man from Stone Creek came by, name of Miller. Told him to get off my land." Miller. The name hit us like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't the man from the final threat, but it was a start. It was a thread. Arthur immediately got on the phone, calling in favors from old contacts, a retired private investigator he knew. The hunt for Miller began. While Arthur handled the legal side of things, I focused on the farm itself. The gold coins, once appraised, were more than enough to halt the foreclosure. We paid off the most critical tax arrears, shocking the county clerk's office, and put the rest in a trust to fund the legal battle ahead. That simple act of writing a check, of taking control, was one of the most empowering moments of my life. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was a landowner, a steward. I started working on the house, cleaning away the layers of dust and neglect. I washed the windows, and for the first time in a quarter century, clear sunlight streamed into the rooms. I patched the leaky roof, mended the sagging porch step, and began the monumental task of clearing the overgrown yard. Every task, every swing of a hammer, every weed pulled, felt like an act of defiance. I wasn't just fixing a house, I was reclaiming my home. I was honoring the people who had fought for it. The work was hard. My muscles ached constantly, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of purpose. The community, the small town that had been a vague memory, slowly started to materialize. The mailman, a friendly guy named Tom, started leaving my mail on the porch instead of in the rusted box at the end of the drive. He told me he remembered my grandparents, remembered them as good, hard-working people who kept to themselves. The woman at the local hardware store, a sharp-eyed lady named Carol, gave me a discount on supplies. "Your granddad paid his bills on time," she said, as if that explained everything. It's good to see a Vance back on that land. These were small gestures, but they meant the world. They were threads connecting me to this place, weaving me into its fabric. I wasn't just some outsider who had inherited a piece of dirt. I was a part of its history. One afternoon, an old pickup truck rumbled up the driveway. An elderly man with a weathered face and kind eyes got out. He introduced himself as George, my closest neighbor. Quote 35, he said, his voice a slow country drawl. Quote 36. We talked for over an hour, leaning against his truck. He told me stories about my grandfather, about their shared struggles with drought and early frosts. And then, his voice dropping, he told me about the pressure. He said, shaking his head. He looked me in the eye. Quote 39. The call from Arthur came 2 weeks after he'd started the search. I was up on a ladder, scraping old paint from a window frame, when my phone rang. "Leo," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "We found him, Miller. He's a real estate consultant in the city now. My PI friend paid him a visit, pretended he was looking to acquire some rural land quietly. He got him talking. Miller bragged about his time at Stone Creek, called it the Wild West days. And he mentioned his old boss, the guy who ran the acquisition team, the guy who gave the orders." My heart hammered in my chest. I held my breath. "What's his name, Arthur?" "His name is Robert Carlyle," Arthur said. "And you're not going to believe where he works now. He's the vice president of land acquisition for Horizon Corp." The world went silent. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Stone Creek hadn't vanished. It had just changed its shirt. Carlyle was the link. He was the man who had been running the intimidation campaign all those years ago. He was the man who had sent someone to deliver the final threat. We still didn't have direct proof that he ordered the accident, but we had a direct line from the harassment to the executive offices of the company that was trying to buy my land today. We had motive, we had a pattern of behavior, and we had a name. The giant had a face, and we were about to punch it. The next steps happened fast. Armed with Carlyle's name and his documented history with Stone Creek, Arthur filed a new, much more serious lawsuit. We weren't just rejecting an offer anymore. We were suing Horizon Corp for a history of corporate harassment, intimidation, and wrongful death in connection with the acquisition of our land. It was an audacious move, a David and Goliath story played out in legal filings. The lawsuit was a declaration of war. Horizon's response was swift and predictable. Their high-priced city lawyers sent back a blistering dismissal, calling our claims, quote, 45, quote, "They painted me as a disgruntled heir trying to cash in on a family tragedy. They denied any connection between their executive and the long-defunct Stone Creek development. They were trying to bury us in paper, to bankrupt us with legal fees before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. But they didn't know about my grandfather's war chest, and they didn't know about Arthur Davies, who fought with the tenacity of a bulldog." "Let them posture," Arthur said, a grim fire in his eyes. "This is what they do. They try to scare you into submission. We don't scare." The legal battle was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Motions, depositions, discovery requests. It was a world I didn't understand, a language I didn't speak. But I trusted Arthur. My role was different. My job was to save the farm. I knew that the best way to honor my grandparents was not just to win in court, but to bring their home back to life. I worked from sunup to sundown. I cleared the fields of rocks and weeds. I repaired the fences George told me my grandfather had built by hand. I found an old tractor in the back of the barn, a rusting beast that hadn't been started in decades. It took me a week of tinkering, of reading old manuals and watching videos online, but one evening, with a roar of black smoke, the engine sputtered to life. The sound of it echoing across the valley was the sound of hope. It was the sound of a heart starting to beat again. I wasn't a farmer. I was a kid who grew up in city apartments and group homes, but I was learning. I was my grandfather's grandson. It was in my blood. As news of the lawsuit spread through the small town, something shifted. People who had been cautiously friendly before now became openly supportive. Old farmers would stop by, offering advice on planting, on irrigation. Carol from the hardware store started a small donation jar on her counter. Quote, 48, quote, "People would drop in a few dollars, a quiet act of solidarity." They saw my fight as their fight. I was standing up to the kind of faceless corporation that had been quietly buying up their valley for years, changing their way of life. The fight for my farm had become a fight for the soul of the community. One evening, a local journalist came by. She wanted to hear my story. I was hesitant at first, but Arthur encouraged me. Quote, 49, he said. So I told her everything. About the letters, the aquifer, the threats. About Robert Carlyle. The story ran on the front page of the regional paper. It was picked up by a state-level news blog. Suddenly, Horizon Corp wasn't just dealing with a lawsuit from a lone individual. They were dealing with a public relations nightmare. The pressure worked. A few weeks after the article ran, we got a call from Horizon's lawyers. They wanted to talk, not about a dismissal, but about a settlement. They were offering to triple their original offer. They would pay me a life-changing amount of money. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and drop the lawsuit. The ghosts of Stone Creek Development would remain ghosts. Robert Carlyle would keep his job. They would get the land and the water. Arthur laid out the offer on the kitchen table. the same table where I had first read my grandmother's letter. "It's a strong offer, Leo," he said, his voice neutral. "Enough money to go anywhere, do anything. No one would blame you for taking it. You've already won, in a way. You exposed them, you honored your family. You don't have to carry this fight forever." I looked out the kitchen window across the fields I had worked so hard to clear. I saw the new fence posts, the green shoots of a cover crop beginning to sprout. I heard the hum of the old refrigerator I'd managed to fix. This place was more than just land now. It was a part of me. Taking their money would be an admission of defeat. It would be selling my history. It would be letting them win, just on my terms. My grandfather's words from his last letter came back to me. "This is my fight, not yours. But this land, this water, it's a part of you too. Whatever you do, son, do it with a full heart." I thought about the past few months. The back-breaking work, the small kindnesses from my neighbors, the fierce loyalty of Arthur, the quiet pride I felt every evening looking at what I had accomplished. My life finally had meaning. It had roots. Selling this place would mean pulling up those roots all over again. It would mean becoming that drifting, anchorless kid once more, just with more money in his pocket. "No," I said, my voice clear and firm. "We're not settling." Arthur looked at me, and a slow, proud smile spread across his face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "Then let's go to court." That decision, that single word, was the real inheritance. It was the moment I stopped being the boy who was left behind and became the man who chose to stay. The money, the land, the water, they were all secondary. The real gift my grandparents had left me was the chance to become a person they would be proud of. The fight wasn't over. In fact, the hardest part was probably still ahead. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was home. The months that followed the rejection of the settlement were the most difficult, and yet the most rewarding of my life. Horizon Corp, realizing we wouldn't be bought off, escalated their tactics. Their lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to drown us in paperwork and drain our legal fund. They hired private investigators to dig into my past, looking for any dirt they could use to discredit me. They tried to paint me as an unstable, opportunistic drifter, but they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. My life had been one of survival, not crime, and every tactic they used only strengthened my resolve and galvanized the community around me. The story of the farm became a local legend. Donations to the legal fund grew. Volunteers started showing up on weekends to help me on the farm, people from town who believed in what I was doing. George, my neighbor, organized work crews to help me rebuild the collapsed section of the barn roof. Carol, from the hardware store, used her network to get me discounted lumber. We were a small, scrappy army fighting for our piece of the world. During this time, I truly came to understand what my grandfather meant when he said the land had a soul. It wasn't just dirt and water. It was a living thing, a network of relationships. I learned the names of the birds that nested in the old oak trees. I learned the patterns of the deer that came to drink from the creek at dawn. I planted a small vegetable garden where my grandmother's used to be, using the seeds from old, dusty packets I found in a shed. When the first green shoots pushed through the soil, I felt an irrational surge of pride. I wasn't just cultivating plants. I was cultivating a connection to my past and a belief in the future. The farm was healing, and so was I. The empty, lonely spaces inside me were being filled with the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of hard work, and the warmth of a community that had embraced me as one of their own. Finally, our day in court arrived. The courtroom was packed. On one side, a phalanx of slick, expensive lawyers representing Horizon Corp. On the other, just me and Arthur. But behind us, The benches were filled with my neighbors, with people from town, with the local journalist who had broken the story. I was not alone. The trial was brutal. Horizon's lawyers tore into my story, trying to portray my grandparents' letters as forgeries, my claims as fantasies. They brought in experts who testified that the, quote, 56, quote, was just that, a tragic but common roadside incident. But Arthur was magnificent. He was a small-town lawyer, but he had the heart of a lion. He calmly and methodically presented our evidence. He put Miller on the stand, and under relentless questioning, Miller's smug confidence crumbled, and he admitted to the campaign of harassment under the orders of Robert Carlyle. When Carlyle himself took the stand, he was the picture of corporate composure, denying everything. But Arthur presented his final piece of evidence, something we had discovered hidden in the back of my grandfather's ledgers. A tiny, almost illegible note of a license plate number jotted down on the date the final threat was made. The plate was traced to a rental car, hired for one day by a man who was a known associate of Carlyle, a man who specialized in corporate security. The link was made. The jury saw it. In the end, they didn't find Horizon Corp. Guilty of wrongful death. The burden of proof was too high after 25 years. But they did find them guilty of a sustained, multi-decade campaign of harassment and conspiracy. The damages awarded were significant, more than enough to pay off the remaining debts, secure the farm's future, and establish a trust for its preservation. But the money was not the victory. The victory was the truth. The victory was hearing the verdict and looking back at the faces of my neighbors, their eyes shining with tears and pride. The victory was walking out of that courthouse not as an orphan, but as Leo Vance of the Vance Farm. Today, life is quiet, and it is good. The legal battle is over, but the work continues. I am a farmer now, in title and in spirit. The fields are productive, the house is warm and full of life, and the barn stands tall and strong. With the settlement money, I worked with a state conservation group to place the aquifer under permanent protection. No one will ever be able to exploit it. It will continue to nourish this land, this valley, for generations to come. It is my grandparents' true legacy, and now it is mine. I didn't get the perfect fairy tale ending. The scars of my past are still there. The grief for my grandparents is a quiet, constant companion, but it is no longer a source of pain. It is a source of strength. They live on in every sunrise over the fields, in the taste of the water from the well, in the steadfast purpose I feel every single day. I found so much more than a secret in that barn. I found the truth. I found a home. I found myself. And so, my story comes to a close, at least for now. But it leaves me with a question, one that I want to leave with you. What is the most valuable thing you can inherit? Is it money? Is it property? Or is it something else? For me, I learned that the greatest inheritance I received was a story, a choice, and the chance to fight for something that mattered. It was the gift of purpose. I want to thank you for listening, for spending this time with me. If my story resonated with you, if it touched on some part of your own journey of discovery or struggle, please consider subscribing to this channel. We're building a community here, a place for people who believe in second chances, in fighting the good fight, and in the power of finding out who you really are. Share your own thoughts in the comments below. What does home mean to you? What is a legacy you would be proud to leave behind? I read every comment, and your stories matter. Thank you for being a part of mine. Be brave, be good, and live with a full heart.